My son's girlfriend sat across from me at my own dining room table and asked me to write a check for $1.5 million. She called it a family investment opportunity. She had a folder, a smile, and the kind of confidence that only comes from having done this before. Then my son pressed a folded napkin into my hand under the table. I opened it in my lap without looking down. 4 words in his handwriting. Dad. She took everything. I set the napkin aside, picked up my coffee, and asked her one question. That question changed everything that happened next. Before I go on, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what state or country you're watching from. I read every single one. My name is Frank Hartley. I'm 64 years old and I spent 31 years as a licensed insurance fraud investigator out of Charlotte, North Carolina. I retired 3 years ago, mostly because my knees had opinions about climbing stairs to interview witnesses, and partly because I'd seen enough human dishonesty to last several lifetimes. I took up woodworking, started fishing again, and told myself the chapter of chasing liars was behind me. I was wrong, but that's the thing about fraud. It doesn't care about your retirement plans. My son Nathan is 37. He's a software engineer at a mid-sized cybersecurity firm here in Charlotte. The kind of work that requires precision and patience and a level of trust in systems that, looking back, may have made him more vulnerable to people who knew how to fake being trustworthy. He's a good man. Thoughtful, generous, the sort of person who remembers your coffee order and shows up when things are hard. After his mother passed 6 years ago, it was just the two of us, and we'd gotten close in the way that loss forces people together whether they're ready or not. He met his girlfriend at a company networking event 14 months before the Sunday dinner I'm about to tell you about. Her name was Diane. Late 30s, well-dressed in the way that signals money without announcing it. Quick with a laugh, attentive in that practiced way that feels like warmth until you learn the difference. She moved into Nathan's condo 4 months after they started dating. I noticed the timeline but said nothing. Nathan was happy, or he looked happy. I would later understand those aren't always the same thing. I'd met Diane 4 times before that Sunday. She was polished every time. She asked about my career with what seemed like genuine interest. She complimented my woodworking. She made a point of saying that family was the most important thing in the world to her, that she'd always longed for a close relationship with a father figure, that losing her own dad young had left a hole she'd never quite filled. I'm not ashamed to admit it worked on me a little. I wanted her to be who she appeared to be, for Nathan's sake. That Sunday, Nathan had called me the night before and asked if he could bring Diane to dinner. He said she had something she wanted to discuss with me, a business idea, something about investing in their future together. The phrasing was a little stiff, a little formal for Nathan, but I didn't flag it. I made pot roast and set the table for 3. They arrived together, but something was immediately off. Nathan hugged me too long, the kind of hug that's really someone steadying themselves. Diane came in behind him carrying a leather portfolio under her arm and wearing an expression I can only describe as professionally warm. The same face I'd seen on insurance adjusters about to lowball a widow's claim. We ate. The conversation was normal on the surface. Diane talked about a trip they were apparently planning to Portugal. She talked about Nathan's promotion prospects. She was managing the conversation the way a good contractor manages a job site, keeping everything moving, leaving no space for side discussions. Nathan was quiet. He refilled my water glass twice, even though it wasn't empty. After dinner, Diane opened the portfolio on the table between us. I want to talk about our future, she said. Hers and Nathan's. But she looked at me when she said it. She'd prepared materials. Printed pages with headers and projected figures. I noticed she never once said the word investment without the word family somewhere nearby. Family investment. Family trust. Family legacy. She knew her audience. The proposal was this. She had identified what she called a generational real estate opportunity, a development project outside of Asheville run by a group she described as boutique builders with a strong track record. She and Nathan, she explained, were committed to building something lasting together. But the entry point for the kind of stake that would truly set their future on solid ground required capital beyond what they could pull together on their own. She was proposing that I contribute $1.5 million into a joint holding structure managed by herself and a business associate she referred to only as her partner. In exchange, I would receive a guaranteed 6% annual return and a 20% equity share in the development project. I kept my face very still. 31 years in fraud investigation teaches you to keep your face very still. Where I come from, I said slowly, When someone brings printed materials to a family dinner, the first thing you do is read them carefully before you say a word. May I? Of course, she said and smiled like I'd given the right answer. I looked at the pages. While I read, I felt Nathan shift in his chair. Then I felt something press against my hand, below the edge of the table. He was passing me something folded. I palmed it the way you learn to do when you've spent years watching people pass things in places they shouldn't. Diane was watching my face. I kept reading. The documents were professionally formatted. Fonts, logos, projected return charts, a project summary with photographs of land parcels. Whoever had put this together had put in effort. But I'd spent 3 decades reviewing fraudulent claims, and the way a legitimate document differs from a fabricated one isn't always obvious to most people. To me, it felt the way cheap lumber feels when you run your hand along it. Smooth until you find the grain going wrong. Is there a problem? Diane asked. Just a thorough reader, I said. Under the table, with my thumb, I opened Nathan's note. 4 words. Dad. She took everything. I folded it closed. I set it under my thigh. I took a long sip of coffee and looked at my son. He was staring at the table, the circles under his eyes that I'd attributed to a deadline at work, the weight he'd dropped since Christmas, the way he hadn't met my eyes once since they arrived. I looked back at Diane. Tell me about your business partner, I said, the one who manages the holding structure. Her answer came half a second too late. His name is Marcus, she said. He has 15 years of experience in commercial real estate development across the Southeast. He's structured deals like this dozens of times. Last name? Colby, she said. Same as mine. He's my brother. Family business, I said. She smiled. Exactly. We believe in keeping things close. I set the pages down. I told her I needed a few days to review the materials and consult my financial advisor before making any decisions of this magnitude. I said it warmly. She seemed satisfied. The dinner ended with handshakes and Diane talking about how much she appreciated my open-mindedness and how rare it was to find a father who genuinely wanted to participate in his son's future. After they left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time with Nathan's note on the table in front of me. 4 words. But those 4 words told me everything about the months I'd been too comfortable to look closely at. I called Nathan the next morning. He answered on the first ring. He talked for 2 hours. It started with the kinds of things that, told individually, sound like nothing. Diane had asked him to cover a car repair because her accounts were frozen during a dispute with her bank. $2,200. Then her lease on a storage unit she used for staging properties, $1,200 a month for 6 months, paid up front because the owner only took cash and gave a discount. Then a medical procedure her insurance had denied, $9,000, and she'd pay him back as soon as the reimbursement came through, which it never did. Then a short-term bridge loan for a down payment on a flip property she was managing, $40,000 for 30 days with a guaranteed return. The 30 days became 90, and then she'd stopped mentioning it. $83,000 over 14 months, not counting the groceries and utilities and vacations charged to his cards that she'd said she'd split with him and hadn't. The investment proposal at my table was meant to be the final act. Nathan had realized it 2 days before that Sunday dinner. He'd asked her directly what happened to the money from the flip property, and she'd turned the question back on him so smoothly he almost forgot he'd asked it. That night he'd gone through his accounts while she slept, and the total had made him sit on the edge of the tub for an hour, unable to move. He hadn't confronted her. He was afraid to. She had a way of reframing every concern he raised until he was the one apologizing by the end of the conversation. He didn't know what to do. So he called me, and when I didn't answer, he'd driven her to my house and written 4 words on a napkin. Dad. She took everything. I told him I was going to need a week. I told him to go home, keep things normal, and not let her know I was asking questions. He asked me if I was sure I knew what I was doing. I told him I'd been doing exactly this for 3 decades and to trust me. What I didn't tell him was that I'd recognized 2 things during that dinner. The first was the look on Diane's face when I said I needed to review the materials. Not disappointment. Recalculation. Like someone adjusting the approach, not abandoning the goal. The second was that the holding structure document she'd shown me referenced a managing entity called Colby Capital Partners, LLC. I'd written it down on the back of the napkin before I gave it back. That night, I ran the name. Colby Capital Partners, LLC was registered in Georgia 18 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm that specialized in entity formation for a flat fee, the kind that asks no questions. The listed address was a mailbox rental storefront in Alpharetta. No website, no reviews, no filings with the Secretary of State beyond the initial registration. Marcus Colby wasn't a developer. He was a name on a piece of paper attached to a mailbox. I called a woman named Connie Tran the next morning. She'd been a paralegal at the firm I'd consulted with most often during my career, sharp as a blade and twice as precise. I asked her if she could pull any civil filings in Georgia and the Carolinas involving the name Marcus Colby, Diane Colby, or Colby Capital Partners. She called me back in 4 hours. 2 civil suits in Georgia, one filed in Fulton County by a man named Robert Peterson, a 61-year-old retired teacher who had contributed $180,000 to a real estate investment facilitated by a Marcus Colby. The case had been settled confidentially. The other was filed in Gwinnett County by a woman named Sandra Cho, 58, who had wired $95,000 to an account controlled by an entity associated with Colby Capital after being introduced to the opportunity by a woman matching Diane's description. That case had been dismissed when Sandra withdrew it, a pattern I'd seen before. People get tired. People don't want the humiliation. People move on and absorb the loss, and that's what people like Diane and Marcus count on. I reached out to Robert Peterson through Connie. He called me back the same evening. When I explained who I was and why I was calling, his voice got very quiet. "Mr. Hartley," he said, "I signed an NDA as part of the settlement. I can't discuss specifics." "I understand," I said. "Can you tell me generally, without violating any agreement, whether you believe what happened to you was an isolated mistake or part of a pattern?" There was a long pause. "It was not an isolated mistake," he said. That was enough. I spent the next 3 days building a file. I tracked Diane's actual name through a property record search. Her legal name wasn't Colby. It was Diane Marie Pruitt. She'd been using Colby, her mother's maiden name, since at least 2019. Marcus was her half-brother, born Pruitt, operating under Colby since around the same time. I found a third victim through a Charlotte Business Networking Group's old member forum, a post from 2 years prior by a man named Glenn Aldridge, asking if anyone had dealt with a woman named Diane who claimed to represent a real estate development group because he'd wired money and couldn't reach anyone. 7 people had responded with variations of "stay away" and "call a lawyer." 83,000 from Nathan, 180,000 from Robert Peterson, 95,000 from Sandra Cho, whatever Glenn Aldridge had lost. Whatever others existed that I hadn't found yet, these weren't people who made mistakes. They were targets selected by someone who understood exactly which vulnerabilities to press and how long to press them before moving to the close. On day 5, I called my son and told him what I'd found. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Did she ever actually care about me at all, do you think? I didn't lie to him. I told him that what she was good at was making people feel cared for, that the skill she'd developed was indistinguishable from the real thing until you looked at the pattern instead of the moments. I told him that what he'd felt was real, even if she wasn't, and that his instincts had still been good enough to write that note. That mattered. That's what had made the difference. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do we do now?" I told him I'd already drafted a letter to the North Carolina Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, that I'd sent a formal complaint package to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, given that at least 2 of the documented victims were Georgia residents, that I'd retained an attorney named Helen Park, who came recommended by Connie and who specialized in civil fraud recovery. I also told him there was one more thing I needed him to do. I needed him to ask Diane, naturally, over dinner, if she'd be willing to bring Marcus to meet me. Tell her I had some questions about the investment structure that I'd feel more comfortable having answered in person. Tell her I was seriously considering moving forward. He asked if I was sure. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything since I'd retired, which was the truth. Diane called me directly the next morning. Her voice was exactly as warm as it had been at my dinner table, which told me she was confident, which told me she'd done this enough times to trust her ability to close when a target seemed to be coming around. She said Marcus was happy to meet with me. She suggested a restaurant downtown, somewhere public and comfortable. I suggested my office instead, the one I still kept because I hadn't gotten around to giving up the lease. "Better acoustics," I said, and I laughed a little. She laughed too. Settled for Thursday at 2 o'clock. I called Helen Park immediately after. She said she'd be in the room but positioned as my financial consultant, not as legal counsel. She said the recording laws in North Carolina were single-party consent, meaning I could record any conversation I was part of without informing anyone. She said that given what I'd already compiled, the material in that meeting could make or break a criminal referral. Record everything, she said, and let them talk. Thursday came. I arrived at my office early. Helen was already there. I set the recorder on the bookshelf behind my desk, facing forward, completely visible but unobtrusive if you didn't know what you were looking at. Marcus Colby walked in with Diane at 2:03. He was mid-40s, well-built, the kind of man who'd spent time carefully constructing the image of someone you'd trust with your money. Good shoes, easy handshake, a voice trained to project reassurance. He called me Frank within 30 seconds of introducing himself. For the first 20 minutes, I let them run their pitch. Marcus was good. He walked me through the development timeline, the projected returns, the structure of the holding entity. He had answers for questions I'd already discovered were designed to deflect scrutiny rather than provide it. When I asked for the actual parcel numbers of the Asheville development properties so I could pull county records, he said they were under preliminary agreement, and he'd prefer to provide that documentation after we'd aligned on general terms. When I asked for audited financials from a previous Colby Capital project, he said their past projects had been structured as private placements that precluded public disclosure, but that he'd be happy to provide client testimonials. When I asked for his brother's contact information, the one who handled the regulatory filings, he paused for just a fraction of a second. Then he smiled and said he'd pass that along. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I opened my desk drawer and placed a folder on the table between us. Robert Peterson, I said. The name landed like a stone in still water. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. Sandra Cho, I said. And then Glenn Aldridge. And then I said Diane Pruitt. Her real last name. Not Colby. The temperature in the room changed. I spent 31 years investigating fraud for insurance companies, I said. My voice was completely level. I reviewed claims from people who believed they were dealing with professionals who had their best interests at heart. What I learned is that the structure of a con changes. The pitch changes. The language changes. But the pattern never does. Identify the target. Build the relationship. Create urgency. Extract the money. Repeat. Marcus started to stand. I'd appreciate it if you stayed seated, Helen said from the corner. He looked at her like he'd forgotten she was in the room. I'm Helen Park. I'm an attorney. We have everything I've just outlined documented in a formal complaint package that has already been submitted to the Attorney General's office in both North Carolina and Georgia. Your exit from this room does not change what's in that package. He sat back down. Diane hadn't said a word. She was looking at me now. Can I minimize this me? With an expression I recognized from depositions, the calculation happening behind still eyes. How much do they have? Can I minimize this? What version of this can I survive? Here's what I want, I said. I want the $83,000 returned to my son within 30 days. I have documentation of every transfer. I want a signed letter from both of you acknowledging that you will have no further contact with Nathan. And I want the names and contact information of every other person you have approached with this scheme because the Attorney General is going to ask me for them, and whether I can provide them will affect how cooperative this office appears to have been. You can't prove it was fraud, Marcus said. His voice was steady. His hands weren't. I pushed the folder closer to him. The civil judgments. The complaint records. The entity registration showing Colby Capital's mailbox address. Thomas Chen's analysis of the investment documents Nathan had been shown, prepared by a forensic accountant I'd hired on day 3. Pages of it marked up and cross-referenced. Helen spoke again. In addition to the Attorney General's complaints, we have retained a civil litigator who will be filing a claim for recovery of fraudulently obtained funds plus damages, including attorney's fees, next Monday. Unless, of course, an agreement is reached before then. Marcus looked at Diane. Diane looked at the folder. Then she looked at me. You'd really do this, she said. All this over your son's feelings. I thought about Nathan sitting on the edge of the tub at midnight going through his accounts. I thought about Robert Peterson, the retired teacher who'd signed an NDA and moved on and absorbed it. I thought about the next person, whoever they were going to be, that I had the opportunity to make sure this never happened to. Yes, I said. I really would. In fact, I already have. They left without shaking hands. Marcus took the folder I'd given him, which I had anticipated, which was why the copy in Helen's briefcase was the original, and what I'd handed him was a duplicate. Helen looked at me after the door closed. She said, "That went about as well as I expected." I said, "It'll go better from here." She was right that it went better, and I was right that it went better from there. Within a week, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had made contact with both Marcus and Diane. The formal investigation opened under their Financial Crimes Unit, and the North Carolina AG's office joined it as a parallel inquiry. Helen filed the civil suit on Monday as promised. Robert Peterson's attorney reached out, having seen the complaint filing, and informed us that Robert was willing to provide testimony. Sandra Cho came forward 2 days later on her own, having been contacted by an investigator who'd found her through the original Gwinnett County filing. Glenn Aldridge called my cell phone directly. He'd found the complaint through a business network alert service he subscribed to. He said he'd been waiting 2 years for someone to pull this thread. He'd lost $61,000. He said he'd testify anywhere, at any time, without hesitation. 4 victims. Total documented losses approaching $420,000. And that was before the investigation turned up 2 more individuals from Tennessee and Virginia, who'd been approached through a property investment group that traced back to the same structure. Diane attempted to contact Nathan twice during that period. The first time was a text saying she missed him and asking if they could talk. The second was a voicemail, tearful and carefully worded, suggesting that everything that had happened was a misunderstanding that she wanted the chance to explain. Nathan showed me both. I forwarded them to Helen, who sent a cease and desist on his behalf and noted them as potential evidence of ongoing contact in violation of the spirit of what we'd requested. After the second contact attempt, there was nothing. The criminal charges came 6 weeks after my meeting with Marcus and Diane. Wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The federal charges covered the interstate nature of the scheme, the use of electronic transfers, the victims across multiple states. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved on it after the Georgia and North Carolina filings created enough documented pattern evidence to make prosecution straightforward. Both were arrested on a Thursday morning. I know because Helen called me as I was in my workshop sanding the legs of a hall table I'd been building. She said, "They're in custody." I put down the sandpaper and sat there for a minute in the quiet. I hadn't planned to attend the proceedings, but Nathan asked me to come with him to the arraignment. We sat in the gallery together. Diane came in wearing clothes that no longer looked expensive because context changes everything. Marcus looked older. Both of them kept their eyes on their attorneys through the entire proceeding, which is what people do when they can't stand to look at the room. They both eventually pleaded guilty as part of a negotiated agreement. Diane received 8 years. Marcus received 10, the additional time reflecting his role in structuring the fraudulent entities and his prior civil judgment, which the prosecution had submitted as pattern evidence. Restitution was ordered in the full amount of documented losses, to be paid jointly to all 6 confirmed victims. Nathan's portion of the restitution, $83,000 plus interest, arrived in a structured payment arrangement that would take years to complete, which neither of us expected to see in full. But that wasn't the point. The civil suit settled separately. Helen extracted enough from Diane's personal assets to cover Nathan's legal fees and a portion of the principal. It wasn't everything. It was something. I took Nathan to dinner the week after the sentencing, not somewhere fancy. The barbecue place near my house that we'd been going to since he was old enough to eat solid food. We sat in the same booth we'd always sat in and ordered the same things, and for a while we didn't talk about any of it. He asked me eventually what I'd thought the moment I read the note. I told him the truth. I thought, this is why you don't fully retire. He laughed. It was a real laugh. The first genuine one I'd heard from him in months, the kind that starts in the chest and means something. He said he kept thinking about the early days with Diane, the way she'd seemed so genuinely interested in him. He asked me whether I thought any of it was real. I said what I believed. I said that what she was skilled at was constructing the appearance of something real with enough precision that the person receiving it couldn't tell the difference. That wasn't his failure. That was her craft, built over years of practice. His instincts were still good enough to write the note. When things had finally become undeniable, he hadn't frozen. He'd found a way to ask for help. That matters, I told him. Don't let the rest of it make you forget that. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I've been thinking about dating again. There's someone at work, a project coordinator. She suggested we go hiking last weekend. Just hiking. No portfolio, no investment opportunity. She packed sandwiches. I said that sounded like a promising start. He smiled. He said she seemed normal in the best possible way. Normal in the best possible way, I said. After everything, that's the highest recommendation. We finished dinner. He picked up the check before I could reach for it and said it was the least he could do. I let him. Some things you let your kids do even when you could stop them, because it's good for them to be able to do it. Driving home, I thought about what 31 years of fraud investigation teaches you beyond the mechanics. It teaches you that the con is never really about money. Money is just what gets measured. The actual target is trust. Trust in your own judgment. Trust in the people close to you. Trust in the idea that the world has more honest people in it than it has liars. What Diane had taken from Nathan wasn't $83,000. She'd taken his confidence in his own ability to read people. She'd taken the easy openness he'd always had toward new relationships. She'd taken some part of the lightness that people carry when they haven't yet been methodically deceived by someone they loved. The money could be partially recovered. The rest of it would take longer, but he was already building it back. I could see it in the laugh over barbecue. I could see it in the hiking with sandwiches. He was rebuilding, which is what you do. Some nights I still sit in my workshop after I put the tools away and think about the moment Nathan pressed that folded napkin into my hand. 4 words. The trust that it took to write them. The trust that it took to hand them to me across the table with Diane watching. He knew I would do something with them. He didn't know what, but he knew I would act. That's the thing about fathers. The job doesn't end at 18 or 21 or 37. The job is just the job. You show up, you pay attention, and when your kid passes you a note that says she took everything, you put down your coffee and you get to work. They targeted the wrong family. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And leave a comment. I want to know where you're watching from and what you thought. I'll see you in the next one.